Before the Waffen-SS divisions of Nazi Germany became symbols of black uniformed terror, Mussolini's Blackshirts had already shown Europe what a fascist movement in uniform could do. They were not the Waffen-SS yet, but they helped establish the model of political violence, intimidation, and black-shirted power that later inspired Hitler and the Nazi movement. October the 28th, 1922, northern and central Italy. Armed fascist squads in black shirts moved on railway stations, prefectures, post offices, and roads leading toward the capital. Rome had not yet fallen. The state had not yet collapsed. Benito Mussolini was not even inside the city. And yet, by the time the crisis was over, Italy's king had refused to sign the order that might have stopped the march. The prime minister had resigned, and Mussolini was invited to form a government that would bury parliamentary Italy from the inside. That is the pressure point that matters, not the later parades, not the stage mythology, not the image of disciplined black columns marching with total control toward a destiny they had already won. The real question is harsher than that. How did a movement of violent squadristi, local enforcers, ex-soldiers, nationalists, and political street fighters push a constitutional state to the edge and discover that the state no longer trusted itself enough to resist? This is why the Blackshirts matter far beyond Italy. Before Hitler built Germany's own paramilitary instruments of intimidation, and later the black uniformed SS, Mussolini had already shown Europe what a movement could do when it fused uniforms, spectacle, myth, organized violence, and political hesitation into one machine. The Blackshirts were not yet the SS. They were something earlier, and in a way more revealing. They proved that a democracy could be broken before it was formally abolished, and that terror did not need to look like civil war to become political destiny. Mussolini's fascist takeover of Italy became an inspiration and example for Hitler and the Nazi Party, which is exactly why this episode belongs inside a wider SS series. The myth says Mussolini seized power through a dramatic march. The truth is uglier. The march mattered, but not as a clean military conquest. What made it lethal was the mixture of real violence, bluff, elite fear, police passivity, social panic, and royal hesitation. The Blackshirts were dangerous because they were strong enough to wound the state, but also because the state was weak enough to imagine them stronger than they really were. That is the hidden engine. And once that engine starts, uniforms begin to do something more than identify men. They begin to reorganize reality. The Blackshirts had not appeared out of nowhere in late 1922. By then they already had a record. They had spent years attacking socialist offices, trade unions, labor halls, cooperatives, newspapers, and political enemies across Italy. They beat men in the streets, burned buildings, humiliated opponents, and turned anti-socialist violence into a recruiting tool. Landowners and industrial interests often saw them as useful because they crushed left-wing organizations the liberal state had failed to control. So, when the crisis came, the Blackshirts were not an improvised mob. They were the armed expression of a political movement that had learned how to make violence look like order. Once Victor Emmanuel the Third refused to stop the march, the consequences reached far beyond Italy, and the next chapters tied to that decision are already on the way. So, subscribe now before the story darkens even further. That is the first fracture in the legend. Later, admirers like to present fascism as discipline, arriving to save a nation from chaos. But the Blackshirts did not arrive after chaos. They manufactured it, directed it, and then offered themselves as the answer. That pattern would echo again and again across fascist politics in Europe. It is also why these men matter so much in a series about the Waffen-SS. The road to the black uniform as a political weapon did not begin in Berlin. It had already been tested in Italy. By the time the fascist convention met in Naples on October 24, 1922, the threat was no longer abstract. Mussolini and his lieutenants had built enough pressure to make the state choose between force and retreat. Armed Blackshirts began concentrating for the famous March on Rome. Prime Minister Luigi Facta prepared a state of siege. The army could likely have stopped the insurrection if the crown had given the order, but King Victor Emmanuel the Third refused to sign. That refusal changed Europe. It told every armed movement watching from the sidelines that government weakness could be just as decisive as revolutionary strength. And that is why the opening image matters so much. Mussolini did not need to storm Rome like a conquering Caesar. He needed the kingdom to believe that resisting him might be worse than appointing him. That is not a normal transfer of power. It is a state learning, in real time, that legality can be bent by men in uniform before it is broken by men in office. The Blackshirts were the lever. The fear around them was the force. And once the king chose compromise over confrontation, the regime's future brutality was already hiding inside that choice. To understand why the Blackshirts were able to do this, the story has to move backward into the wreckage left by World War I. Italy came out of the war bitter, unstable, and politically inflamed. Economic dislocation, labor unrest, fear of socialism, wounded nationalism, and the sense of a mutilated victory created a climate in which many Italians no longer trusted parliamentary weakness to hold the country together. Fascism did not invent those anxieties. It weaponized them. Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento in 1919, and while its early politics were unstable and opportunistic, its movement gained traction through agitation, nationalism, and above all, violence. The men who came to be called Blackshirts were originally squadristi, members of fascist squads that operated locally but learned to think nationally. They drew on veterans, adventurists, political militants, local toughs, students, and anti-socialist activists. The black shirt was not just a uniform, it was a signal. It turned violence into identity, and identity into belonging. It allowed a man to feel he was no longer one frightened partisan in a fragile state. He was part of a movement that looked harder, younger, and less hesitant than the government facing it. That uniform mattered more than it first appeared to. Uniforms create emotional discipline, even before they create military discipline. They narrow doubt, they give theatrical shape to menace. And the Blackshirts understood spectacle very early. They marched, shouted, occupied space, and used ritual to transform street intimidation into political theater. This is one of the most important links to later fascist movements. Long before the SS became a symbol of ideological loyalty in Germany, the Blackshirts had already shown how clothing, choreographed violence, and political myth could fuse into one image powerful enough to overawe enemies and reassure supporters. But their power did not come from style alone. Between 1920 and 1922, fascist squads attacked labor chambers, socialist clubs, cooperatives, municipal buildings, and newspaper offices. In rural areas especially, landowners often backed them because they saw fascist violence as a practical answer to strikes and peasant organizing. This is the detail that changes the whole case. The Blackshirts were not just rebels against the state. In many places, they functioned as unofficial auxiliaries for parts of society that wanted order restored, but on terms the constitutional state could not openly admit. Violence was not an accidental side effect of the movement. It was one of its most effective political arguments. That is why Mussolini's rise should never be reduced to charisma alone. He mattered, but the movement's local enforcers mattered too. The Blackshirts gave fascism something parliamentary opponents did not have: the ability to make politics feel physically dangerous. A newspaper office could be burned. A union secretary could be beaten. A town could be occupied. A political enemy could be humiliated publicly. Once those things happen often enough, the ballot box does not disappear. It just stops feeling sovereign. That is how democratic systems begin to rot, while their institutions still appear formally intact. And there was another reason the fascists advanced. Many Italians who did not necessarily love fascism feared socialism more. That gave Mussolini room to present himself as the strong hand that could control the streets, even while his own squads were among the most disruptive forces in the country. This contradiction became one of the defining tricks of 20th century authoritarian politics. First, unleash or exploit instability. Then present disciplined violence as the cure. The Blackshirts were essential to that maneuver because they blurred the line between spontaneous movement and organized coercion. By late 1921, the movement had formalized into the National Fascist Party. That mattered because it gave political form to men who had already been changing the balance of power in the streets. Now, fascism could wear two faces at once. One was parliamentary, strategic, and negotiable. The other was physical, punitive, and immediate. Mussolini could talk compromise in one register and benefit from squad violence in another. That double game made him far more dangerous than a mere street agitator. It meant the Blackshirts were not just followers around him, they were leverage in human form. This is where the state began to fail in a deeper way. Italian institutions did not simply face a violent movement. They failed to agree on how serious the threat was, whether it could be absorbed, whether it could be used, and whether it would burn itself out once brought near power. Some conservatives thought Mussolini could be controlled. Some elites thought fascist violence could be domesticated. Some hoped the Blackshirts were a temporary medicine against the left. That misjudgment was fatal because it treated armed ideology as a bargaining partner rather than a transforming force. It is one of the oldest and most expensive mistakes in modern politics. So, by the time October 1922 arrived, the Blackshirts were carrying two reputations at once. To their enemies, they were violent fascist thugs breaking Italy town by town. To supporters and wavering elites, they were rough but necessary men, imposing movement where Parliament had produced drift. That contradiction is exactly what made the March on Rome possible. The squads did not need unanimous support. They needed enough fear, enough admiration, enough hesitation, and enough confusion at the top. Once those ingredients met, the Blackshirts stopped being a local uniform and became a national threat. The decisive sequence began after the Naples Fascist Congress in October 1922. Armed squadristi started converging towards strategic points, and fascist leaders prepared what propaganda would later present as a grand disciplined seizure of power. In reality, the situation was far messier. The March on Rome was not a perfectly ordered revolutionary masterpiece. It was a coercive demonstration backed by real violence and by the possibility of wider breakdown if the state chose to resist. The men often remembered as the quadrumvirs, including Michele Bianchi, Italo Balbo, Emilio de Bono, and Cesare Maria de Vecchi, helped organize the operation, while Mussolini himself remained more cautious than the later myth suggested. He was still balancing pressure and negotiation, threat and invitation. That detail matters. Mussolini did not need to prove that the Blackshirts could defeat the entire state in open battle. He needed the monarchy and the ruling class to fear what might follow if they tried. Prime Minister Luigi Facta drafted a decree for a state of siege. The army, under legal authority, likely could have dispersed the marchers. But the decree needed the king's signature, and Victor Emmanuel the Third refused. Facta resigned. On October 30th, Mussolini was called to Rome and invited to form a government. The regime later wrapped this in myth, but the core fact remained. A constitutional state stepped aside in the face of organized fascist pressure. This is where the accepted version becomes too simple. It is tempting to say the Blackshirts conquered Italy through force. It is closer to the truth to say they won because force, threat, theater, and elite surrender combined at exactly the right moment. On paper, the state still had options. In practice, it no longer trusted itself enough to use them. That is what turns the March on Rome from a dramatic episode into a warning. A government can still possess soldiers, police, law, and constitutional authority, and yet lose because its leadership no longer believes in a decisive response. Once Mussolini entered office, the real trap closed. He did not abolish everything in one night. That is another reason the Blackshirts belong in a broader series about black uniformed political power. Fascist systems do not always begin with immediate total conquest. Sometimes they begin with duality. One hand signs decrees and enters coalitions. The other keeps the uniformed militants ready outside the frame. For about 18 months, Mussolini still ruled through much of the existing machinery while steadily concentrating power. The squads were then incorporated into an official national militia, the Voluntary Militia for National Security, on February 1st, 1923. In other words, the state did not defeat the Blackshirts. It legalized them. That legalization is one of the darkest payoffs in the story. The men who had helped break civil life through intimidation were not pushed back into the margins. They were folded into the state's own body. Violence stopped looking like an external problem and began presenting itself as public authority. Once that happens, repression becomes harder to name because it no longer arrives only as a mob. It arrives with insignia, office, chain of command, and official blessing. That transition from squad violence to recognized power is one of the clearest reasons the Blackshirts function as a true prequel to later fascist political militarization in Europe. Then came the electoral trap. In 1923, Mussolini advanced the Acerbo Law, which gave 2/3 of the seats in parliament to the list receiving the largest vote share, provided it crossed the threshold. The law was presented as a cure for instability. In reality, it tilted the political field heavily in favor of fascist domination. In April 1924, elections were held under this system, and the fascist-dominated bloc won in a climate marked by intimidation and violence. This is the detail that strips away the comforting illusion that dictatorship only begins when elections disappear. Often it begins when elections remain, but fear enters the room first. And then came the name that turned a rotten victory into a regime crisis: Giacomo Matteotti. On May 30th, 1924, the socialist deputy denounced fascist violence and abuse in the elections before the Chamber of Deputies. Soon after, he was kidnapped and murdered by fascist thugs. Public outrage exploded. The Aventine secession followed as opposition deputies withdrew in protest. For a moment, Mussolini's system looked vulnerable. Party badges disappeared. The atmosphere around him changed. It is one of the most revealing moments in the whole story, because it shows that fascism was not inevitable. It was still vulnerable to its own excesses, but its enemies failed to act decisively enough, and Mussolini survived the crisis. That survival changed everything. On January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini effectively declared himself dictator. The constitutional mask had not vanished at the exact moment of the March on Rome. It had hardened, cracked, and finally broken through a sequence: pressure, appointment, legalization of the squads, electoral manipulation, terror, crisis, and then dictatorship. That sequence is why the Blackshirts matter so much. They were not just decorative followers around a future dictator. They were one of the core instruments that made this gradual seizure possible. They helped prove that a regime does not need to overthrow legality in one blow if it can intimidate legality into serving the new order. There is a flatter version of this story that sounds dramatic, but misses the real point. It says Mussolini had a fanatical paramilitary army, marched on Rome, and seized power. That contains truth, but it hides the more dangerous lesson. The Blackshirts did not win only because they were violent. They won because enough of Italy's establishment believed violence could be managed, redirected, or absorbed. That is the hidden factor. A political militia becomes far more powerful when elites stop treating it as an existential threat and start treating it as a useful tool. In that sense, the March on Rome was partly a demonstration of fascist strength and partly a demonstration of state self-paralysis. The army likely could have intervened. The government prepared to act. The king refused the order. Mussolini's genius was not that he had already built an unstoppable army. It was that he understood how far intimidation, uncertainty, and elite fear could carry him before open battle even became necessary. That is why the march was historically decisive and militarily misleading at the same time. It looked like a conquest. In many ways, it was a collapse of resistance. This is where the Blackshirts become more than an Italian case. Their real importance lies in the method they helped normalize. First, create a movement that thrives on spectacle and street force. Second, give followers a visible identity that turns politics into tribal belonging. Third, attack opponents often enough that public life becomes physically uncertain. Fourth, persuade conservative or frightened elites that the movement can be tamed once admitted near power. Fifth, legalize the militants rather than disarm them. That pattern did not remain confined to Italy. Mussolini's takeover served as an inspiration and example for Hitler and the Nazi Party, and the broader fascist playbook of intimidation, plus state capture, became one of the most destructive formulas of the century. But there are also limits that matter historically. The Blackshirts were not the SS. Early Italian fascism was not identical to Nazism, and Italian fascism did not initially center itself on anti-Semitism in the way Nazi ideology later would. Italian Jews could still join the fascist party before the racial laws of 1938. That distinction matters because sloppy comparisons make the history weaker, not stronger. The Blackshirts belong in an SS series not because they were the same thing, but because they reveal a crucial earlier stage in the evolution of black uniformed political terror, the moment when violence, myth, and legalized intimidation fused into a national governing model. That is the part the mythology tries to hide. Fascist propaganda later turned the March on Rome into a near-sacred origin story, a disciplined act of national salvation. But propaganda always cleans the hands of the men it celebrates. The actual record points back to years of beatings, intimidation, arson, political coercion, and the destruction of socialist and Catholic organizations. The movement did not heal a wounded political system. It exploited its wounds and deepened them. The black shirt, in that sense, was not just a garment. It was a technology of political permission. It told the wearer what he was allowed to do, and told the observer what might happen if he resisted. There is also a final irony here. Movements like this often advertise themselves as restoring order, but the kind of order they offer is false at the core. It depends on permanent intimidation. It depends on the humiliation of opponents. It depends on the state becoming less neutral and more tribal. And it depends on the public learning that some uniforms can act with a latitude others do not have. Once that lesson enters political life, the system may look calmer for a time. In reality, it has been restructured around fear. That is not restored order. That is managed submission. So, the deeper meaning of the Blackshirts is not simply that they helped Mussolini take power. It is that they helped redesign what power looked like. They turned militia identity into state identity. They helped convert political violence into administrative authority. They taught a generation of European fascists that modern dictatorship did not need to arrive looking like old-fashioned military coup theater. It could arrive half legally, half paramilitarily, with one hand raised in constitutional language and the other resting on a truncheon. After Mussolini secured dictatorship, the Blackshirts did not disappear into nostalgic legend. They remained part of the fascist state through the voluntary militia for national security, and became woven into the regime's machinery of control, ceremony, and coercion. By the 1930s, the Fascist Party dominated daily life, far beyond the streets where the squads had first made their name. That is another important payoff. A political militia does not have to remain visibly chaotic to remain dangerous. Once it has helped bend the state itself can continue the work with greater reach and cleaner paperwork. The later collapse of Mussolini's regime in July 1943 does not erase what the Blackshirts achieved in the years that mattered most. The Fascist Grand Council turned against Mussolini. King Victor Emmanuel the Third dismissed him, and with the fall of the regime, the old Blackshirt prestige collapsed too. But that ending should not comfort anyone too easily. The damage had already been done. Italy had spent 2 decades under fascist rule. Europe had already watched one successful fascist dictatorship prove that parliamentary weakness, street violence, and political theater could be fused into a new form of regime. That is why these men matter in a Waffen-SS series. Not because every black uniform means the same thing. Not because the Blackshirts and the SS are interchangeable. They are not. The point is more serious than that. The Blackshirts helped establish one of the 20th century's most poisonous demonstrations. That a movement of black uniformed political militants could intimidate a state, enter it, legalize itself, and then help reshape national life around obedience, spectacle, and repression. Later regimes would radicalize, militarize, and racialize that formula in their own ways. But the Italian precedent came first, and its example traveled. And that brings the whole story back to the image that opened it. The March on Rome is remembered as a moment of fascist momentum. It deserves to be remembered also as a moment of institutional surrender. The Blackshirts did not simply reveal what fascism was. They revealed what a frightened establishment might permit when it feared democratic conflict more than authoritarian violence. That is the hidden warning beneath the mythology. Men in black shirts are dangerous. States that decide they can live with them are often more dangerous still. So, who were Mussolini's Blackshirts before Hitler built his own black uniformed political soldiers? They were the men who proved that the uniform could become a weapon before the rifle fired. They were the men who turned street intimidation into national leverage. They were the bridge between paramilitary theater and legalized authoritarianism. They were not yet the last word in fascist terror, but they were one of its clearest early rehearsals. And once Italy showed that this could work, Europe had already learned something it would pay for in blood. That is the final reversal. The Blackshirts are often remembered as swaggering thugs orbiting a loud dictator. They were more consequential than that. They helped make dictatorship modern. They showed how violence could wear a uniform, enter politics, and then teach the state to imitate the movement that had threatened it. That is why the black shirt was never just cloth. It was an announcement. It said that politics no longer belonged only to parties, laws, and speeches. It belonged to organized intimidation, and to the men willing to make public life afraid. And once that announcement had been made in Italy, the century did not forget it.